Hi, I'd like to buy some ski boots.
Sure, no worries. If you'd like to take a seat. Hey guys, welcome to Bootorials. I'm your host Craig, and today we're going to talk about... So in this series of videos, we're going to dive a whole lot deeper into boot fitting for those that are interested. Now I have covered a lot of surface level information in the past, but I feel it's now a great time to go into a bit more detail and see the process that I like to take when fitting people up for ski boots. So buckle up buccos, because we're about to dive into this rabbit hole. Now in order to find a good pair of boots, or to know how to solve your ski boot problems, the more info you have at your disposal, the better equipped you'll be for this process. And it all starts with the feet. And the whole point of boot fitting is to accommodate and optimize the feet for the specific action of skiing. Now we do have some unique forces exerted on our body when we ski, so we do become heavily reliant on our feet for steering, absorbing different shocks, navigating around the mountain, and staying in control. But boot fitting is not a medical procedure. Now the goal is to not alter someone's natural physiology, but instead harness the best of it and really create a boot that is going to complement the skier and become an extension of them. So by dialing in a ski boot to fit really well, not only will you make the whole experience of skiing a lot more comfortable and enjoyable, but you're also able to step up the performance and the amount of power generation that you can get from a boot. So with all that said, let's check out everyone's favorite appendage.
Oh.
So here we are taking a closer look at some feet. Now this model is just a fantastic demonstration to show you just how complex a foot can be. Now each foot that we have has 26 bones and over 100 muscles, tendons and ligaments. But along with that you can see that there is a whole heap of blood vessels, nerves and fascia. So all in all, a foot is a beautiful thing. It's what allows humans to be mobile. It's a very dynamic element to your body. And they're just so nice looking. And moving on to the next one, and we can also take a look at the foot from more of a skeletal perspective. Now you can see with the foot there is a whole lot of little joints, and I often refer to specific bones when I'm talking about ski boot issues. So let's just run through all of the bones for their terminology. You can see the main bone of your lower leg, which forms your shin and inner ankle, is the tibia. Along the outside of your leg and to your lower outer ankle is the fibula. These sit down upon the main bone on the inside of your ankle joint, known as the talus. And this talus then sits upon top of your heel bone, known as the calcaneus. Now as we come forward through the midfoot, the first bone you'll find on the side here is the navicular. And in front of this it is joined to 3 different cuneiform bones. And then along the outside here we have the cuboid. Now along the forefoot there are the 5 metatarsals, which then connect to your toes, and the 3 different stages of the phalanges. Now there is a whole heap of a range of feet. Now with these other diagrams, they're actually really good at illustrating the different arch heights that you can see, and also how that affects the structure of the foot. So if we start with this one, this is what's commonly referred to as a flat foot. Now with a flat foot, you can see that the medial arch is collapsing down quite low in its height, and it's also forcing this ankle joint to rotate inwards. So this is known as pronation or as overpronation. And you can see with this overpronation that it's forcing also this navicular bone to shoot in quite hard to the inside, and also in the forefoot ducking it outwards towards the outside. Then we can look at more of a neutral style foot, and you can see this just has more of a medium arch height. It is quite stable and well aligned and neutral in its position. This is really the ideal thing we're looking for in a foot. And then the extreme of a high arch foot. Now you can see with the high arch foot, it is forcing this stance into more of a supinated position, rolling to the outside. And you can also see that just how prominent this medial arch is, along with you can see there's even contour through here in the longitudinal arch. Along with this, you can also see it correlates with a higher instep, and also the tension that's put through this foot. You can see it's actually forcing pressure and lifting up on the toes. So quite an extreme case, but overall, when we're talking common foot types and structures with arch heights, 90% of people are going to fall into this realm, with more on the side of being in between a heavily pronated flat foot and more of a neutral foot. Most people are just experiencing a little bit of pronation, so sitting in between here. Now, of course, we have the extremes in either case, but that's where the majority of you guys will be with your feet. And now that I have some legs in front of me, we can start talking about this in a real world setting. Now, before we begin, the first thing I really recommend doing is having a pen and a piece of paper or boot fitting card or notepad. And the reason is we're going to start taking a lot of information in, so being able to write this down and always be able to refer back to it later is going to be a really handy tool. Now, I always begin a boot fit with a conversation. So the first thing we need to ask the skier is going to be things about their ski boot history. So have they owned ski boots before? Was there any problems with their feet in the last pair? What are their goals going into a new ski boot? But also really good questions like, are there any previous injuries that we may need to address as we're looking for a new pair of boots? And then we're going to move into starting to make some visual observations. So you want to get your victim to sit in front of you with their shoes and socks off. And the first thing that I'm looking for is that general first impression of foot volume. So taking a look at the feet and seeing the ratio of width of forefoot to volume of instep to heel to lower leg. And just taking an initial imprint of what you're seeing in front of you. And then what we want to do is to get the skier to stand up. And we want to take note of if we're seeing any difference. So are we seeing a change in the foot from how it looks in that unweighted seated down position to now once the foot is weighted in this standing position? Now, people tend to do some funny things when they're standing in front of you being judged like this. So in order to avoid any ducking of the feet or leaning off to one side, I like to break the tension by asking the skier to walk in place. And stop. And then we want to get the feet into more of a skiing stance. So if we just widen them out to a little bit under shoulder width apart and have the feet facing forward. And then again, to avoid any bias, if you just get your focus onto the wall behind me and bend your knees slightly forward. Now, there's a few things I'm looking for here, and namely with the feet, are we seeing any variance? So does the forefoot widen as the knees bend and more weight and pressure comes onto the balls of the feet versus how they look when they are in that more upright position with more weight on the heels? Also pay attention to arch height. Are we seeing any pronation or anything collapsing and moving out as the knees bend? Along with this, I'm focusing in on how it looks from a stance alignment. How do the knees and hips track again as the ankle joint is being flexed and knees bending forward? So all of this is super valuable information, and we want to take notes on everything that we're seeing. And the other thing that I start to pay close attention to here is overall foot shape. Now, foot shape becomes important at the time when you're starting to select appropriate boots to match. Now, the closer that you can get a boot last to match the shape of a foot, the easier the whole process of boot fitting becomes. So we really want to pay attention to here and take note of the contour that we're seeing down either side of the foot and how this combines with the overall shape of the toe area. Now, something that becomes interesting is you start to see a whole lot of variety in foot shapes and how this is linked to your heritage. But the thing that becomes useful when you're taking note of foot shapes is you start to develop this memory bank, and you start to see which boots have become successful with which types of feet that you're fitting them into, and you can always reference back to that in the future. So why this foot shape and boot last combination is so important is your feet will naturally sit within this boot shell a lot closer. Generally, you're going to reduce the amount of work required to make the boot fit because you're not getting excessive pressure points. It's not forcing the foot into an unnatural position, and when it's closely matched, it can also take a little bit extra compression through the foot. So again, a very handy tool to have in your arsenal is to really focus in on this shape and see how that correlates to the different models of ski boots. And lastly, before moving on, we can also hone in on any of the protrusions of the foot. Now, when I'm talking about protrusions, it's any areas of prominence or lumps and bumps on the feet that will need to be accommodated for. Now, these can happen naturally or even be caused over time with bad footwear and even caused by previous injuries. But skiers' feet are notoriously bad for having little extra lumps and growths that need to be dealt with. So what I'm talking about here, generally we can first look at the bony parts of the foot. So things you'll commonly see is the first metatarsal having a bunion, the fifth metatarsal just behind the pinky toe having a tailor's bunion. Also up front here, you can sometimes get kicked out and curved toes. As we move back on the foot, you can see along the back of the fifth metatarsal, sometimes there is sort of extra fleshiness there, a bit of a fatty pad, or even a bony growth there known as the styloid process. Also on the back of the heel is a common place to get impacts and develop what's known as Haglund's deformity and a bit of a heel spur. Also on the inside of the foot, you can get red and inflamed by impacting on the navicular bone or even having hard pressure against the medial malleolus, your inside ankle. So these bony protrusions, generally you need to get the pressure off. When they're getting impacted or experiencing friction inside of a ski boot, your body reacts. It wants to send fluid to this area. It becomes red and inflamed and can become quite painful. So these are approached in a few different ways. But I'm not just talking about these areas. We also want to take note here of, are we seeing any prominent blood vessels? So this is generally across the top of the foot and also in and around the ankles and down the back of the leg. Now, it's not always the case, but having prominent blood vessels like this can be causing different issues as far as numbness and blood flow restriction through the feet. Now, other things that we can see are also natural growth, so things like cysts or even really irritated nerves can also create certain areas that will need to be targeted. But essentially, I don't really proceed with a boot fit as if they are there. I'm taking note of their exact position and their sizing, and then as we go forward in the boot fitting process, making accommodations as required. Okay, and now we're through all of those visual observations. We can now move on to taking some mobility tests. So the first thing that I like to do is check the dorsiflexion. So if you can get the skier to sit back down. And a few quick tests that we can do. The number one is just going to be have the knees bent at a 90-degree angle. We want to ask the skier to raise the front of their feet, leave their heel on the ground. Now, a couple of ways that we can check for this. Number one is just see if you have adequate range of motion through the ankle and we look like we're going to be in a safe range. Or we can actually take an actual measurement and get a degrees range of motion. And next, I like to check the mobility of the ankle joint itself when it's in an unweighted position. So what I'll do is cradle the back of the heel in my hand, ask the skier to loosen and leave all the weight out of their leg. And then what I'm doing is actually rotating and seeing how much resistance or tension there is through the ankle joint. Also how much mobility there is through the forefoot. Now back in regards to that dorsiflexion, you can actually feel how much tension there is through that Achilles tendon in your hand. But also what's interesting here when we're inspecting the feet like this is people's lives tend to show up in the structure of their feet. So you're going to notice the difference right away from, say, someone who spends all day in a pair of work boots compared to someone who's sitting at a computer desk. Also with ladies, you're definitely going to notice the difference between a dancer and a power lifter. So I just find that interesting that you really see how the activities that we do day to day affect our biology. So you do need to take this into account also with what other sports you may be doing and how this may interact when we're looking to particularly get a foot into a ski boot. But other things I'm looking for here while I have the foot in my hand is, are we seeing any sort of twisting through the forefoot? Is there any noticeable callousing along under the met heads? And also you can sort of see here how the toes are lifted up and raised. And do we have any maneuverability to the foot in this unweighted position? Then one of the best mobility tests that we can do is what's known as the windlass mechanism. Now what we're doing with the windlass action is lifting up on the big toe, which is adding tension to the plantar fascia. Now this in turn makes the foot react in a certain way. It is lifting and raising the height of the medial arch. It's inverting the calcaneus and rotating the tibia fibula until the talus is in a more centered position. Now this foot position is what's known as subtalar neutral. Sub meaning below, talar referring to the talus. So all of these bones through the foot now in a nice centered alignment. Now it's going to be dependent on how the foot reacts to this windlass mechanism, and it directly correlates to then how we're going to support the foot from underneath with a footbed. Now we can do this windlass test both in a seated unweighted position and also standing up. And you probably will notice a difference once we do have weight on the feet, how far this maneuverability can occur. Now, generally a foot that is highly mobile is going to respond better to a stronger arch support, and a foot that is a bit more restricted, you're going to need to create something a little more supple. But the windlass test is just a great way to see if the foot can even get to this subtalar neutral, which is the ideal foot position inside a ski boot, or if you're going to need to make other accommodations as we move forward. And now that we have all of our visual observations and mobility tests all done, we can then move on to what's a pretty important part of this process, and that is taking some measurements of the feet. Now there is a whole bunch of different ways that we can measure the feet, and since I'm basically a caveman in the ski boot fitting game, I'm always reliant on my trusty old Brannock. But you will see other tools out there. This one, for example, is one that Salomon produces. It allows you to measure both feet at the same time. Also, there is one they make with a blue film which takes an impression of the sole of your feet, which is really good to see that weight distribution. And since we're in the 21st century, there's a whole bunch of technology options out there now, and you will see shops that have 3D scanning software, which will take a full 3D model of your feet. Now, this is something that's even accessible to you. If you go into your phone's app store, there is dozens of feet scanning apps. I personally have used the Fisher scanning app, and it actually did a pretty good job. What you're doing is taking 3 different images and it's building a fairly simple 3D model, and the measurements were fairly accurate. So that's something that you might want to look into, but I don't want to take any responsibility there. Fisher obviously getting your data, so use at your own discretion. But what I like to do is basically go back to the Stone Age, and we're going to use a Brannock and a couple of pieces of paper, and we want to first take an outline of the feet. So now with this outline drawn out, it becomes really useful because you can use this directly to take some measurements with either a ruler or a tape measure. Also, it's very handy to use as a template in the future when you're referencing against shells or doing some custom fitting. So I always recommend a good outline of the foot. And then with the Brannock, what we want to do is take direct measurements. We want to know the foot length in centimeters. We want to know the forefoot width in millimeters. And then also it's very good to take a few more measurements of the feet. And if you have a sewing tape measure, the next measurements we want to take is going to be instep volume. So one side of the heel to the other. And then there is two more measurements that you can take that will, in certain situations, help you out with certain boot fitting. And that is going to be a direct floor to instep height on the top of the foot, and also from heel up to the bottom of the muscle of the calf. Okay, so now we have a pretty comprehensive amount of information about the feet. So you will have the templates and all of the sizing to reference. Also with your notes, we have reference to all of the dimensions, foot shape, stance, arch height, mobility, and foot protrusions. So what we want to do next is take all of this info and move into the next phase. You could consider this the architectural and design phase, and we now want to move into creating the foundation and how we are going to support this foot before we move into the boot selection. So join me in the next video as we start to talk about trim to fit, fully custom, and also minimalist footbeds. Thanks for watching. Stay rad. Be a Patriot. Signing out.